Hi, it's Dwyer. It's September 29th, 2025. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, folks, they had a big celebration in Omaha for Terrence Crawford. They congratulated Crawford. The public was out. There was a lot of love in the air. Of course, shortly after that great public event, Terrence Crawford was held at gunpoint by the police. Right? We all need to realize that boxing is an oasis. You see fighters, when I'm looking at fights, I don't think about how a fighter looks. I don't spend a lot of time on what nationality the fighter is, right? I do look at, is the fight in the guy's hometown, right? I do look at how loved is a fighter. But even the love extends to, people of different nationalities. Just realize that there is a bigger world out there. At the end of the day, who's Terrence Crawford? He's the same person I am. He's a black man in America, right? Simply outrageous. I put up a link to this story on black7777.blogspot.com. This is about as outrageous as it gets. You're celebrated in your community for your professional greatness, only to be held at gunpoint. It's absurd. Only to be held at gunpoint in supposedly red state Nebraska. Figure it out. This is also a moment for boxing. I believe, and boxing's a dangerous sport. I don't want to look away from that. Right? Let's keep it 100 here. Boxing's a dangerous sport. Fighting when you're older greatly increases your risk of CTE, long-term harm. Right? I privately would like to see more fighters on top walk away from the sport with their health, with money in the bank. Right? These days, you can invest a lot of your money in gold. You don't have to, risk it in risk assets, right? But I'd like to see more fighters leave earlier rather than late, right? It's like Bernard Baruch, the great investor, talks about how he always, sold before the top, right? But let me say, the public misunderstands boxing. While brute strength helps in boxing, I'm just here to tell you that boxing really is a craft. It's a skill game. You show me a big puncher like Deontay Wilder, and I'll show you a guy who spent a lifetime figuring out how to deliver that big punch, figuring out how to position you so that you're in line with his straight right hand. Right? Manny Pacquiao has a lot of movement. He's moving his head, he's bouncing around and stuff like that. At the end of the day, he has practiced, he has perfected how to land his feet to surprise an opponent with his straight left. Now, in a craft, guys with experience at the highest levels who are idiosyncratic, have a certain skill set that those preparing to fight him can't duplicate in camp. They have a decided advantage. Now, we're in an era where the public is starting to catch on to guys who switch, right? Tyson Fury, Terrence Crawford, right? Andre Ward. These are guys who, in the ring, can give you suddenly a whole different look, a different set of angles, a different set of equations to solve. Right? One of the best I've seen do it. I mentioned him during his career. He's now years after his career, but he wants to come back to boxing. His former champion, James DeGale. Right now, just understand, this guy was in his own sport. I've seen Fury. I've seen Crawford switch hands and fight for whole stretches, right, of fights, not just rounds, in a certain stance, right? I've seen that. Look at the Terence Crawford-Kell Brook fight. Crawford comes out one way, a couple of rounds in, he decides, okay, let me switch hands. And it threw off Kell Brook. There are very few. Dmitry Pirog, if you remember him, he's the guy who gave Danny Jacobs his first loss. There are very few who can change hands midstream and then change it back. Right, folks? That's the genius of James DeGale. Now, the problem with DeGale is that there were holes in his defense. Right? DeGale was offensively blessed. He could change hands. He could have a left foot forward. He could switch it to a right foot forward. And he could rough you up with hooks and stuff like that. Right? But defensively, if you could hang around the pocket, if you were mentally tough and not thrown by a guy changing angles, if you were mentally prepared for it, you could hit DeGale hard. In fact, DeGale lost his front teeth boxing. Right? You could rough him up. You could hurt him. Well, James DeGale was in bare knuckle boxing. Right? Won a championship there. Now he wants to come back to boxing. When a fighter's out of the sport for a while and he comes back, you need to get the data. I don't know what division he's going to come back to. 175 is loaded right now. It's loaded. It has some fighters who aren't gifted in terms of being in the flow. Right? Anthony Yard is one of the hardest punchers I've seen. Right? He's one of the hardest punchers I've seen. But Anthony Yard is a bit predictable. Right? He was jumping around against Beterbiev. You knew Beterbiev could wait him out. Right? Anthony Yard doesn't have enough of a back foot to be back foot for the full 12. Right? He was in against Lyndon Arthur, and he thought he won the fight. Right? He was moving around. Yard's the guy who is one of boxing's best punchers pound for pound. But just like Ray Robinson saw himself as a song and dance man, right? Robinson saw himself as an entertainer, then a boxer. Right? Anthony Yard sees himself as a back foot guy. But you and I know the back foot is a different country. Right? People who master the back foot, they think differently than front foot guys. Right? You and I understand that. Right? Sonny Liston had a magnificent jab. It was great. Right? It wasn't a mobile jab. He didn't think about using his jab like Ali did. Like Tyson Fury did. Well, with James DeGale, in my opinion, you have the full offensive package. This is the guy who can switch righty-lefty several times around. He's not blessed defensively. Don't expect Pernell Whitaker. Don't expect Terence Crawford. Right? If he comes back at 175, things get interesting. Let's name the equivalent of Anthony Yard at 200. And that's the man they call CBS. A nickname I like, Chris Billum Smith. Right? Hard puncher. Hard puncher. Not a boxer. Right? He could stop. He could beat a Richard Riakporhe. Right? He could beat a Lawrence Okolie. Right? I would argue both Riakporhe and Okolie are better boxers than Chris Billum Smith. But understand, boxing's rock, paper, scissors. If you hit hard enough, you can offset a boxing gap. So Anthony Yarde fought Lyndon Arthur a second time. And that time he destroyed Lyndon Arthur. Right? If DeGale comes back at 200, right, he'd have a tough time against Gilberto Ramirez. He'd need to stay away. Let's just keep it 100 here. He'd need to stay away from J.O. Pataya. But a fight between him, an eventual fight, right? Because he's been out of boxing for a while. I don't consider bare knuckle to be an equivalent to boxing. Right? A fight against Chris Billum Smith, world-class guy, would be competitive. Right? So we've seen Manny Pacquiao come back in his 40s. And you have a whole group out there who believe he beat Mario Barrios, right? A much bigger group than the small group, let me raise my hand, who believes Canelo should have been awarded the fight against Terence Crawford, right? Crawford, of course, himself is older, right? Crawford would be 38 for his next fight. So I'm looking forward to James DeGale coming back simply because I want to see how fighters around him handle that technique. Right? I don't want to see that James DeGale get mauled by, a David Benavidez. But if DeGale eventually earns the shot, there are going to be times in that fight where Benavidez, who is unbeaten as I make this video, would be looking at him puzzled, thinking, is he righty or lefty? Right? If you're a fighter keying off an opponent's feet, where you look and you say, wow, this righty isn't in a position where he could get leverage on shots because his left leg is not in front of his right leg in a way where he can generate leverage. Understand, it's those high-level thinkers who would get thrown off by James DeGale's ongoing shuffling of his feet. Let's close this video talking about the heavyweight division. Folks, look, I'll be unpopular. I don't care, right? Moses Itauma. I don't think he's ready. I don't. For Alexander Usyk. Let me add, too, that I'm shocked that Usyk is continuing the fight. Maybe I have it backward. Right? I feel that if Roy Jones had walked away from the sport when he won the heavyweight title, he'd be considered today to be much bigger than he is. And today he's considered to be, a guy who in his prime was the best in the sport pound for pound. Right? I mean, that's today. You can imagine a guy jumps up to heavy, beats the heavyweight champion, then leaves the stage. Right? And in Jones's case, he was smaller than Usyk. Right? I understand if you go way back, Usyk fought Sean Porter in the amateurs. Right? But Usyk as a professional, he was up at cruiser. Right? You thought of him as weighing 200 pounds. Then he jumped to heavy. This is before the Bridgerweight division existed. You thought, oh, he's coming up from one floor down. And truth be told, boxing is flooded. Not exactly flooded, but You have guys like Bob Fitzsimmons coming up to heavyweight from middleweight. Stanley Ketchel dropping Jack Johnson. Johnson gets up off the canvas, but the middleweight champ dropped him. Right? Michael Spinks up from light heavy. Think, Beterbiev jumping up to the heavyweight division and then beating Larry Holmes twice. Right? Evander Holyfield jumping up in weight, fighting some damn good heavyweight champions, right? Riddick Bowe, Lennox Lewis, and actually having competitive fights, right? He beats Bowe, he gets a draw against Lewis, right? Well, let me just say, Moses Itauma, I don't think he's ready for Usyk. If I were counseling Itauma, though, I'd have to privately think, how much of a bubble is he right now? Right? In other words, I was in a bar this weekend. Some guy who, is a heavy member of the Terence Crawford fan club, he and I were having a conversation, and he was saying, hey, I said, man, I hope Crawford walks away from the sport. The time to walk away, folks, is when you're unbeaten. You've just made a lot of money. There's money in the bank. They're having a parade for you in Omaha, right? You're three-time undisputed champion. What else do you have to prove? Isn't that walking away on top? Right? And the guy said to me, well, and there is a video online of Bomac saying Crawford has 2 or 3 more fights. The guy said to me, hey, well, what about Crawford at 160? I don't see it. Right? Was that Carlos Adames roughing up Hamza Shiraz? I thought Shiraz won the fight. Many of you don't. The fight was ruled a draw. Right? Let's just say Carlos Adames did better against Hamza Shiraz than Edgar Berlanga did. Right? I couldn't imagine Southpaw Janabek not being completely ready for Terence Crawford moving away from him. Right? So the guy I was in the bar with mentioned Crawford at 154. Folks, in the comment section of this video, I want people who are interested in this question to answer the question of who do you believe the better athlete is? Because, folks, boxing's a young man's game. Right? I say that in a video where I'm looking forward to, late 30s James DeGale returning to the sport. But understand, I'm interested in DeGale on styles, not because I feel DeGale's going to be light heavyweight champion or, cruiserweight champion. I'm interested in DeGale based on angles. See how guys react to him. Right? With Crawford, folks, it's win, championship, or nothing. Right? I'm not sure if people want to see Crawford in some non-title fight at 154. Right? Crawford's a guy, quite frankly, who didn't look as good against Madrimov as Virgil Ortiz did. Right? Crawford's going to go to Ortiz's division. What's in it for him? Right? Let me tell you, too. The most expensive money you'll ever earn are those fat paychecks that you think you don't deserve at the end. Right? Crawford's better off riding into the sunset unbeaten than riding into the sunset after another Madrimov fight. Right, folks? He, put it this way, you don't want photo finish fights against guys who aren't named Canelo. Right? I understand there are those out there who believe that, The Canelo fight wasn't close to a photo finish fight. Fair enough. Right? Fair enough. Well, now you have Richard Torres, one of the best young heavyweights out of the United States, warning Moses Itauma. If I were advising Itauma, I might send him to a loss. I'd be honest with him, right? It would be like in the 80s, having the Hawk, forget his name mid-video, but he went to fight Mike McCallum when we were wondering whether he was unbeatable. I'm not talking about Aaron Pryor. I'm talking about the guy from the islands who fought McCallum in Jamaica. Right? Forget his name. He had problems later with Gerald McClellan. But understand, when you have a guy who's a bubble, and you have promoters willing to pay top dollar as if the guy is established, right? Sometimes you have to go for the payday. Why? Because if he fights Usyk, he's going to get Usyk level money, right? He'll get championship level money. If he fights Richard Torres, Moses Itauma might end up with a loss, right? If he fights, let's name another guy, Vianello. This is a guy who, lost to Richard Torres, but Torres is frantic. It's an urgent pace, right? Vianello does solve Torres for a part of that fight. He has length. He has height. Folks, there's a possibility that he might be too much for Moses Itauma. I know that's not the way the public sees it right now. Right? So you have a young phenom. Right? Young phenom. The public believes he's the future. Right? Do you throw him in with a dangerous dude who doesn't have a title, but who had a title at one point? Joe Parker. Right? Do you throw him in with a dangerous dude who's been in the ring with concussive punchers? Right? High risk. Who doesn't have a title? Do you throw him in the ring with a concussive puncher who you know has flaws in his game? Martin Bakole. Or do you go for the brass ring, have him fight an unbeaten Usyk, where he's one punch away, mathematically, from beating Usyk? Itauma only has to land once, right? Understand, I saw Dillian White take a lot of hard shots from a lot of people and not have the lingering effects he had against Moses Itauma. Right, so now you have Richard Torres calling out Moses Itauma. Right, folks, if I'm the Itauma side of the ledger, I don't take that fight. If a sanctioning body is going to make me a mandatory, right, let me make two statements that sound at odds with each other. Right, this is boxing. The sport's at odds with itself, right? Do I believe Itauma is ready for Usyk? No. Right? I'll answer that in one syllable so there's no confusion. No, I don't. Right? Do I believe Itauma should take that fight? In this era, where the heavyweight division has never been deeper. Folks, the money's never been better. You have difficult heavyweights who, if they were paying peanuts, the guy might say, you know what, let me hang with my wife and kids. Right? I still got my faculties. I'm still relatively healthy. Let me move on with my life. I had my day. Let me move on. Right? But in this day and age, they're sticking around. Right? You get a call from Riyadh Season. You get a call from Frank Warren. You get a call from Eddie Hearn. They need to fill out a card in some venue that has a lot of people. You understand the press is going to be there. You understand the guy you are fighting is extremely talented, but he's overrated. Right, folks? There are many heavyweights today waiting to answer that phone. On Styles, I think Vianello gives Moses Itauma all he can handle. On Styles, Torres, relentless front foot. Vianello, boxer with size, jab. Right? Maybe he'll figure out that he doesn't have to be in the pocket slugging it out with you. Right? This is a guy who handled Effie Ajaba's power, for crying out loud. Right? Close fight. Close fight. My point to you is, if you are advising a fighter, and always be honest with the fighter, I tell the fighter, I don't think you're ready for Usyk. I think Usyk, like the people calling me on the phone here, I think Usyk is hanging around because he sees that a Joe Parker is going to be impatient. He's going to fight a Fabio Wardley. Right? He knows the heavyweight division is going to narrow. Right? There's going to be a winner of that Joe Parker Wardley fight, isn't there? Right? There's some opponents he won't have to fight because he's an older champ. And if the opponents are fighting each other, the guys who lose those fights don't have the moral authority, if it's a legit loss, to show up and say, hey, you should fight me next, when there's a guy who won that fight. Right? Usyk also knows he's the people's champ right now. Right? Not Itauma. Itauma's the people's opponent, isn't he? The people's champ. Can do things like, this is part of heavyweight history. Right? In the Ray Robinson era, Robinson, of course, gets stripped because he wouldn't defend the title. Hell, George Foreman got stripped because he wouldn't defend the title against, people. Right? You have another group, the Riddick Bowe group, that threw the belt in the garbage. Right? He didn't want to fight the guy who beat him in the Olympics, Lennox Lewis. Right? He got big money fighting others. Lewis was willing to accept step-aside money up to a point. You have the group that'll throw the belt in the garbage. Just understand that right now, Usyk has that power. So Usyk's looking around. Joe Parker's fighting Fabio Wardley. I think Usyk knows he can beat Wardley. Maybe Wardley gets lucky against Joe Parker and takes care of a problem. Right? Here's what I think I know. One of the fights that helped out the Usyks of the world. Right? Daniel Dubois beat Filip Ergovic. Major setback for Ergovic. That helped Usyk. Right? Ergovic's reconstructing his career. I believe Usyk knows those are dangerous waters. He doesn't have to fight Ergovic. The public is in love with Moses Itauma. If you're on the Itauma side of the ledger, folks, you may never get this opportunity ever again. This is a mind-blowing opportunity. You can't get the opportunity from Joshua, from Fury. Right? You can't get this opportunity. An unbeaten champion who many people, I had a poll. Look at the Dwyer community page. I had a poll where I said, is this guy the best heavyweight of the last 20 years? Many of you said yes. Right? Just understand, people view Usyk as the best heavyweight of the last 20 years. If you're Moses Itauma and you get lucky, because that's what it would take, folks. right? He gets lucky, lands a big shot on Alexander Usyk because Itauma doesn't have the skill set to beat Usyk by decision. Right? Let me say hard lines here. I can because, of course, I've been online for years, right? So it's one of these things where, you know, we can just be blunt here. I don't, I believe where you make your money is in the gap between what people think is the consensus and what's actually true. Right? The public's in love with Moses Itauma. What's his biggest win? Dillian White? Right, folks, I'm just telling you, I thought White was the betting side of the play for that match. Right, folks? I know the public says, ha, 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 he showed you, blah, blah, blah. What did he show me? That he's ready for Usyk? Folks, Usyk's the betting side of the play for any dust-up with Moses Itauma. Right? Usyk's been in the ring with concussive punchers. Folks, don't question the punching power of AJ or Daniel Dubois. Right? You don't want to do that. So let me just say, if I'm advising Moses Itauma, I'd be honest with him. Right? I assume they're being honest with him behind the scenes. I know he's been in places where Mike Tyson's been. Right? And he talked to Mike. Right? Open question. I was alive in the 80s. I remember the Tyson era. Right? Open question on whether it was too much too soon for Mike Tyson. Right? Maybe he would have been better off with that Spinks fight going a few rounds. Let's remember, too, that's the only time Michael Spinks lost. Michael Spinks not only beat Holmes twice, if you believe the scoring, at a minimum, it's a miracle that a light heavyweight is in the ring with Larry Holmes, for crying out loud, and is even competitive. One of the best champs I've ever seen, right, in any weight class. But understand, Michael Spinks actually stopped Jerry Cooney. Right now, Tyson blows through Michael Spinks. Was he ready for Buster Douglas? I'd say no. Right, folks? He knocks down Buster. I'll agree, the count looks long to me, right? But it's within referee discretion. Douglas continues. Douglas hits Tyson with a textbook uppercut. Right? I'm telling you, I was in Tijuana that night. We heard cheering across the street. I ran across the street, and I'm telling you, me and a bunch of guys run into this bar, and we see Tyson with a swollen eye, and we were shocked. We had never seen Tyson busted up before. Right? Well, folks, understand, when he's in the ring, and this is, Tyson years later, right? He fights Peter McNeely and stuff like that. When he's in the ring with Evander Holyfield, wasn't there a technique gap in that fight? Right? Let's just say Tyson's fortunate because he blows through the division, knocking people out. Right? Then when he faces major competition later, Riddick Bowe flames out. Right? He never faces Bowe. Those guys were classmates in Brooklyn, believe it or not. Right? Didn't know each other in school. But Prime Bowe, who didn't have the best legs, Prime Bowe would have given Tyson all he could handle. The Riddick Bowe who beats Jorge Gonzalez, that would have given Tyson all he could handle. Right? Big guy with a jab who could throw combinations, who could frustrate a Evander Holyfield. Holyfield has problems getting inside on Bowe. He has no such problems against Tyson. Right? So Moses Itauma, and I'm a Tyson fan. I love Tyson as heavyweight champ. He was one of the better heavyweight champs. But a Moses Itauma is idolizing a guy who might not be ready to make a go of it against this level of heavyweight competition. Right, folks? The division is deep. You remove Usyk from the equation if Tyson Fury steps back into the ring. I'm not saying Fury's the athlete he once was. But my God, the guy's a technician. Right? First fight, the fight where he loses possession of the heavyweight title. And we need to start talking about possession. What is that, a split decision to Usyk? Split decision? Folks, I don't expect Moses Itauma to be close enough to Usyk to be involved in a split decision. Right? That's the fight where Fury loses the title. Second fight, Fury believes he won the fight. Right? It's a perception game. He had lost possession. So Usyk's able to go the distance and he wins the fight. Right? I know we're ignoring possession in the fight involving an undisputed champion who doesn't get hurt, who, comes out and is on his front foot throwing decent volume against Terence Crawford. I understand that. Folks, I'm telling you, at heavyweight, the love for Usyk is much more pronounced than the love was at 168 for Canelo. Right? Usyk's coming off of a destruction, 2 knockdown destruction of Daniel Dubois, not a William Skull type fight. Right? So if you are with Team Itauma, looking at the young guy, we were all young guys once, knowing the young guy's not believing you. When you say, player, I don't think you're ready for Usyk. Right? Crafty, southpaw, mover, stamina. Right? I'll agree. Looks to me like the path to success against him is a body attack. Right? Kabayel is more ready for Usyk than Moses Itauma. But I would tell Itauma, player, let's take the fight. Why? Because Richard Torres is too dangerous. Because, quite frankly, AJ's too dangerous. I know there are those out there who don't believe that. Right? I've heard the stories, AJ emotional over the loss of Daniel Dubois. Right, folks? AJ had a shot in that fight right before the last knockdown. AJ only has to be right once. Right? For all the skills that the wrestler guy who knocked down Tyson Fury had, right? The ability to switch hands, right? He can switch hands, right? Major power. He didn't have a chance in that AJ fight once AJ landed, right? So my point to you is, if I'm advising Moses Itauma, I tell him, knowing to myself that he's not ready for Usyk. I tell him that. But then I also say, we need to take this fight. Why? Because in the off chance that you land and stagger Usyk, understand Usyk's dominated the heavyweight division to the point where he hasn't even been staggered. Right? In the off chance that you stagger Usyk, and I mean badly stagger, not daze him, which AJ did do in like the 9th round of the second fight or something like that, right? If you have moments, if you knock him down, right, just that alone will justify us having had this fight, right? Whether Itauma wins or loses the fight, right? He would thrust himself into that rare air. Right? If he scares Usyk into retirement, that would thrust him into the rare air. And God forbid, if he lands, if he does a Hasim Rahman, if he lands on Usyk, and Usyk hits the canvas and loses his title, right? Then you're a champion, then you're getting huge money. Think about the run that Daniel Dubois has just had. Right? When you think about Daniel Dubois, the first or second sentence has to be, yes, he was a heavyweight champion. Right? So just understand, the division's deeper than Moses Itauma. It has young talent. It has deserving talent. Right, folks? Cowboy y'all beat Zhili Zhang, for crying out loud. I mean, I don't know what else to say. You know, this heavyweight division, I don't think Moses Itauma is the obvious heir apparent. If he gets the shot, ready or not, he has to take the shot. Right? Understand, if you look on scorecards, all Jersey Joe Walcott had to do was stay upright against Rocky Marciano. That's it. He would have defended his title. Marciano got lucky, got the stoppage. Right? We view him today as an unbeaten champion. Right? I would argue that Rocky himself may not have been fully ready. Right? Archie Moore knocks him down. Ezra Charles splits his nose to where the referee tells him, Rock, this is the last round, basically. It's now or never. Right? Rocky Marciano survived some near cliff, off the cliff experiences. Right? I don't believe Moses Itauma is ready right now. Of course, I was on the wrong side of the play with the Dillian White situation, but let me make another point. If Itauma gets a lot of attention from gamblers, right, you can be wrong against him a few times. If an opponent delivers once, you could have a net profit. What odds did you get if you were on the Buster Douglas side of the play against Mike Tyson? Anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.